Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Ben Jones with Batdorf from Bronson Coffee Roasters. We're going to do something a little bit different today. If you're familiar with the videos, you can see I'm set up in a little different fashion. Let me see if this extra light over here helps. It might help in a little bit, so we'll leave that on. All right, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about troubleshooting pour over brewing. Specifically, we're going to look at grind size and some things that happen when we go a little bit too extreme in the fine direction. So, this was prompted by I had a customer in the cafe, bought some coffee, and we asked them if they wanted it to be whole bean or should we grind it for them. That was a new question to them. They'd never been asked that before. So we talked a little bit about about how we should grind it, and they said, well, at home, one of us uses an espresso machine, and the other uses a French press or sometimes the Chemex. To my knowledge, I've not seen, and in my experience, I've never seen a grind size that works both for traditional espresso and on the Chemex. And here is why. I have two Kalita Waves, identical brewers, and there are the Kalita Wave filters. Now these we do not need to rinse, so I'm not going to do that. And then over here I've doses of 19 grams coffee. This is the traditional grind size that I might use for a Kalita. You could describe it as medium drip. You can see on the video, even there in my hand, it's a little chunky, a little coarse. It's going to be adequate for our Kalita brewer. And then, so that we'll call that the control in this very, very scientific experiment. And then on this side, I have 19 grams coffee that would be ground for espresso. You can see, even in my hand here, that it has created clumps. Fine coffee likes to clump up. It's just a trait of fine coffee. So I'm going to put that into this Kalita. There are 19 grams there, and not sure if you can see on the camera. Here in the fine, there are some good chunks and clumps, whereas on this side we have our nice, just moderately coarse medium grind. I'm going to shake both of those just to kind of settle them in, help to level out that bed. As a further example of how much clumpy we can get out of very fine coffee, here are some of the finely ground coffee, and you can see that if I pinch it, it will stay peaked. You can almost, pretend it's like sand at the beach that's slightly wet, and you can, create little sand castles and things of that sort. All right. The biggest challenge that we get with grounds that are too fine, it's twofold. Essentially, clogging becomes an issue. The fine particles are more likely to clog up the paper filter, restricting flow and reducing our quality by over extracting the coffee. It makes that brew far too long, and we pull out excuse me, all those flavors that taste like burnt matches, rubbing alcohol, things of that nature. We don't like that. So, but specifically, when I start to pour onto these, what I want you to try to observe, that might help a little bit. Let's look first at our regular coffee. As I pour my water onto there, it begins to fall between the particles and it soaks downward, and then we get the bloom. Now here, when I pour water into finely ground coffee, notice how it initially wets, and then it just kind of starts to set on top. We're looking at a lot of, essentially it's kind of sealing itself off. If we could dive into this, we would notice there are massive pockets of dry coffee. So here is pour number 2 on our traditional Kalita. We've given an ample bloom time, and you can just see that looks like the dried bed of a river. And as we put more water onto it, it sets on top a lot longer than we see on our traditional one. We can get to a point and we can add water fast enough so that you won't notice quite as much the difference between the two. See here, if I get a big rise on this, you know, it'll look like it's brewing, it'll look like it's doing okay. But what's happening on the inside is there are actually chunks of dry ground coffee in this too fine cup. You see that bubble? That was a little pocket of dry coffee that just got burst. Right here, we have the equivalent of pancakes that weren't, where the batter wasn't mixed well enough. So you end up getting a little pocket of flour and or baking soda in your pancake. And that is not delicious. We don't want that in our coffee. We don't want that in our pancakes. We don't want that in our banana bread. So I'm just going to keep pouring that on there. And you can really even see the difference in the coloration of these. This coffee that we're pouring into right now, it was just way too fine. And as you're exploring manual brew, single cup pour overs, whether you have or do not have your own grinder at home, I would always err toward too coarse before I would go toward too fine. I'm going to take this, I'm going to give it a little stir, see if I can get that worked up a little bit, make sure we don't have any dry pouches. All right, and that's even just dripping through at an incredibly slow rate. So I'm going to bring up my traditional ground coffee, my control group, up to about a little over 300 grams of water. And I just need a little bit more here on my fines. I'm going to go and rinse the edges on these Kalita brewers. It's okay to do a quick rinse around the edges to catch these portions here where we have some fines that get left high and dry. It's also, you're more likely to get this happening. The high fines, that's more common when you go too fine on your grind. So to troubleshoot pour overs like this is more of a grind issue. If you have a grinder at home and you're seeing this sort of action, this is a very extreme example because hopefully we would never be grinding this fine for pour over. But if you're seeing dry pockets, a lot of bubbling, where we're not getting even distribution of water, even saturation, start to move your grind setting a little more coarse. Coarser coffee is much easier to work with. We can manipulate flow with coarser ground coffee by changing our pour rate. If I need to stretch out the time on this one, I can pour a little more slowly. I can't really do much on here to manipulate the brew time. And this thing is still dripping down. You can see there's a lot of water left sitting in the brew bed, whereas our course has been sitting dry for about a minute now. And this is just sludgy and thick. Super fine coffee, a lot of restriction on that flow. The only way that I really know to get around grinding too fine, using technique or trying to increase the flow rate, we can apply some pressure. So that becomes espresso, where we're applying high pressure to it to force the water through that bed so that it'll vacate more quickly. Or we can use an AeroPress because that gives us control over the separation of those grounds. Whereas with a pour through, with a percolation brewer, we're looking at just waiting on gravity to overtake the resistance of the fine particles. So, in summary, I'm expecting this to be delicious, this to be not so much. Always err on the side of too coarse, much easier to manipulate. Too fine, that's it's a little bit too far, and we've gone a little too aggressive in our fines. So there we are. Thank you for joining today. Of course, it wouldn't properly be a good coffee video unless I took my little mug and had a little bit of coffee. So, happy Friday morning. Here we have now my cup of coffee. This is the Kenya AA Ndarawini. It's a really nice coffee, little jasmine, some apricot, kind of nectarine. So there we are. I don't know if you can see, I don't know if you can pick this up on the video, but this looks like, and this is just a sludge. This is a, yeah, it looks like melted chocolate. If you put chocolate chips in a double boiler, that's what that looks like. And that's not a good thing when we're looking at brewing coffee. We want to have, you know, when we're talking about coarse ground, we want to be able to see still some of those bits and pieces. All right, so thank you for joining on Monday. I will not be here. You'll be chatting with Brendan from our St. Petersburg, Florida training lab. He's looking forward to filling in for me. And then I will see you back very briefly on Friday of next week. Have a lovely weekend. Go out and do some good in your community. See you next time.